struggles in some other countries, it sounds progressive to talk about the struggles based on ethnic identities. In Tanzania, most of the progressives would denounce that, including myself, and that is because of our history. Immediately after we attained independence, the decolonization project was about getting rid of tribal and racial identities, because those were identities that were imposed in most cases. If you read, especially the works of Monjane, how he tries to historicize them and construct, like look into the genesis of ethnic or tribal identities, so that there was no citizen. So Nyerere's project was, one, nation building, second, development. And nation building meant, in the first place, of getting rid of tribal-based identities and racial-based identities. There was a debate in 1960, for instance, the citizenship debate. So you had the Africanists saying that citizenship should only be black Africans. So people Asian origin or of European origin who found themselves in Tanzania would not become citizens. They even threatened to resign, saying no, we are going to create a de-racialized and tribalized nation state. So that's in Tanzania. But with all these dispossessions and havoc and devastation caused by neoliberalism on the national agenda, these identities came back, and in most cases they were used by elite people from upper classes to mobilize people from the grassroots, basically to prevent class struggle, like identities based on class. So you have people mobilizing politicians mobilizing people on ethnic identities and say, people from this region of the country who are benefiting, not the rest of us. So in most cases, the alliances, the exploiters and the exploited, they are forming alliances based on religion, based on race. For the first time, there was like a hatred against people of Asian origin. So Professor Shivji, for instance, you see him, you think he's Indian. I think he's Tanzanian, and when you ask him, he's Tanzanian. But for the first time in the history of the country, if you accidentally happen, not accidentally, but it's for historical reasons, happen to be Asian, they think you're not Tanzanian. And that was all the effects of neoliberalism. But on the other hand, there are also progressive movements based on class of smallholder peasants trying to reclaim their land in the rural areas. So there is a mixture of that in the source of the progressive movement.
Dzifa? I think you take it from that. I would say that in Ghana right now, there's growth, but we have experienced what we call jobless growth. So we have teeming youth unemployment. But the question is, why are the youth not going to agriculture? Why are they leaving the rural areas to the cities? And statistics have shown that farmers in Ghana are aging. Right now, they are 60 years average farmer, the age of an average farmer is. So what is happening? I think that project we've done, what we've seen is that, and I don't know how to read it, whether to read it to be a resistance to agrarian labor, or the youth are moving into small scale mining, and the farmers are complaining that the youth love money, so they are moving to small scale mining, which is quick money making activity. So how are the youth themselves seeing that kind of mobility from agriculture into mining? And so agriculture is suffering in that way. They think they are better off mining regardless of the environmental damage that they might have causing in that regard. But the larger question is that farm succession is not planned. And I know we are a very oral society. So your father doesn't tell you that you are going to take over the farm. Apart from that, lineage practices are very they circumscribe what a father can do or a mother can do. So in matrilineal societies, a father cannot leave a farm to a son. You can only leave it to your nephew. Your nephew might not have been a laborer on that farm. Because of that, son started revolting. I will not work with my father. So they leave. So that leave that gap. The nephew is not there in the household and the son is also gone. Wives have also left the farms. Many women are now going to trading. Why? Because of the question of who controls the income. So trading gives me that autonomy to control my income. So broadly, that is the gender and the age question in Ghana. But the question, the other thing about resistance is also how farmers are now reading these movements of labor from one place to another. So they think that men are lazy. So if a man is lazy, what they do? They will go for female laborers. So women who have their small farms, they can retire to those farms, but they still take wage labor because they have to pay school fees and other things. So basically that's what we have in Ghana.
And that would be great if we could also insist on cases of adverse incorporation, because if not already that resistance take place, there are other ways people react to this.
Well, I wanted to continue with this thing of ethnicity and gender and stuff, and it's true that Nyerere and Machel had this and others, Kaunda and stuff. They had this plan of killing the ethnic to build the nation, right? But it's true that within our countries the development was already uneven, and there are some places that tend to be more developed than others, and people relate that thing to ethnicity. In Mozambique, for example, people from the central part of the country and the northern part of the country, they say, why is only South Mozambique that has infrastructure, that has health system and stuff? So I think the issue of ethnicity has to do also with how do you develop your country in terms of how do you manage to prioritize all the regions of the country. In terms of gender, well, women in Mozambique, they historically I would say the guardians of land, because through the industrialization in South Africa, men were forced to go to the mining sectors, and they were the one who worked the land to feed the families and the kids. But even if the women were the guardians of land, patriarchy is much more stronger than that phenomenon, because now men, for their regions in Mozambique, when if a woman lose the husband, she cannot inherit the land. So I think it's I think that the gender question in the land and labor issue is very important, and I think we should continue to discuss that and see how are the different realities in our countries.
And maybe it would be interesting to link it with India later and the rise of male farmers society, to talk about masculinity and how it affects. Shonda? It's anyone, maybe later we can pick up.
Just to, I've been gone, I'm trying to find my bearings. But in terms of the question of race and gender, I think in South Africa we, of course, apartheid was based on the classification of people according to Indian. So there was this four colonial or apartheid classifications: white, Indian, colored, and African, right? But during the liberation struggle, and this is the unique thing of South Africa, that those tensions were resolved, where the liberation movements then argued that all of us are oppressed, whether you are Indian, and so everyone was categorized as black, which is an anomaly. People always struggle with it when I explain in the US, and they don't understand how can Indians be black and what. But it's a political category that we were all oppressed. Now with the transition, and this is the limitation of nationalism, when the ANC government came to power, they operated on the basis of four nations, right? Instead of taking that progressive aspect, we see the emergence of some sort of ethnic nationalism, that people explain their material conditions and the deprivation in terms of it's the Zulus who are only benefiting, it's the Indians as a class that has always collaborated, and it's this, and in the Western Cape you have this Khoisan identity that is emerging. So even when labor and how people explain the problem is in terms of white supremacy and whiteness, but then the class dimension get lost, right? So of course there are racism in South Africa, but this is the tensions, the things that we have to resolve. In relation to gender as well, the big question what we have is traditional areas of former Bantustan. In the same way that Boa explained, where the state is now drafting legislation to strengthen tribal authorities' area of land, which basically they're evolving in a tribal land that they lead that can, as a form of accumulation in non-capitalist areas. So this is just the issue of race that we are faced with. And then also, just briefly, is to, when we think of this question, of course we are discussing it in terms of national boundaries, but in the South African case, you see the emergence of surplus population being absorbed into the South African economy, and it generates another phenomenon amongst the working class of xenophobia, right? A sort of right-wing nationalism that we are contending with, and this is how I have reverted to political language, the petit bourgeois sort of facilitate and try and capture progressive struggles and shift it into, I wouldn't like to call it identity, because there are material bases for which people say there are racism, but it has its limitations, right? And this is the thing that we have to contend with, is the limitations of nationalism and how far it can take us towards true liberation, which should be something anti-capitalism beyond capitalism. So I will stop there and maybe contribute later when we talk about resistance from people.
I would like to add something on this issue, because with this thing of ethnicity particularly, or identity politics in general, I don't think it's that much a matter of agreeing with it or not. I mean, at political level you can agree or disagree with it being right or not being right, but as a researcher, what you cannot do is deny that they are on the rise, and what we need to do is to explain why is this so. So we can disagree on it as a political prospect, but still we need an explanation to see why is this on the rise. And it was very interesting to hear Sabatho saying how it was the neoliberal attack putting this back into that. At the end, my general reading would be that it arises as a promise of a solution of the class conflicts that are not being solved otherwise. So when these class conflicts become seemingly impossible to resolve through other ways, then you find the rise of this identity politics as a kind of promise of resolving. And what we have to see then is precisely what are those class conflicts that are not being solved other way, and that lead to the rising of this identity politics. And sometimes those class conflicts or those material conflicts are just and are legitimate. And I have again the case of the people with which I'm studying in Namibia, which is a people that suffered the first genocide of the 20th century, which suffered much more dispossession than any other peoples in the territory that was occupied by the Germans, and which never so addressed their land claims in regards to all of that history of oppression, which is clearly differential in relation to other peoples of the territory. So that's a legitimate material conflict that is not being solved, and it's not being solved precisely under the ideology of one Namibia, one nation. It's it which is preventing to address their specific legitimate claims on the land, and that is leaving only the identity politics as a mean to try to solve that material conflict. So I think we have to look at those things before just stating we agree or we disagree with identity politics. They are there. You cannot disagree with their existence.
and we have 5 minutes left, so maybe when reacting we can also talk about the prospects in our regions. We have 5 minutes left, so maybe you can also talk about the prospects.
Okay, I just would like to mention, thinking concerning the crisis of neoliberalism, in 2007 and 2008, Brazil's government launched this program in order to combat the crisis that merged combating the crisis and producing housing. It's a massive program to produce housing, and for the first time, a massive program to produce housing for low-income families in Brazil. So it stimulated the civil construction. So it was strategically to tackle those both problems, the crisis and the housing deficit. But what happened with this program is that it perpetuated the segregation that happens in the organization of the city. I mean, Brazil is a very racist country, and since the end of slavery in 1888, farmer slaves did not enter the labor relations as free workers that can sell their labor force. Is that the way to say in English? They were segregated, and the government had this policy to bring European workers in order to whiten the country, the population. So that segregation, especially in the case of São Paulo, which is where I do research and one of the most big and populated cities in Brazil, the low-income, poor black families live in the peripheries of the city. So that program in the 2000s perpetuated that segregation. And nowadays, people are actually also being evicted from the periphery. I mean, why are those people being evicted also from the periphery? They are being evicted, there's high unemployment, people cannot pay rent anymore, so they go and occupy both lands in the periphery and empty buildings in the center of the city. Just for an example, in 2010 there were 300,000 of empty rooms in empty buildings in the center of the city of São Paulo, and less than 200,000 families without a house. So mathematically, that maybe it's a problem that could be solved, but it's not interesting for the civil construction, for instance, to reform the buildings. It's interesting to construct new buildings in those peripheral areas. So those movements, landless workers movements and housing movements, homeless movements, occupy those lands in the periphery and empty buildings in the center. Those occupations are increasing, as is also increasing the violence of their eviction, because there is another conflict very important in Brazil, which is the conflict between the right to housing, which is in Constitution, and the right to property, which is also in Constitution. So those rights are always in conflict, and the right to property usually stands up from the right to housing.
Okay, then I think in the interest of time, we've run short of time. Maybe we have a concluding remark from someone here. There's always a pen issue in regards to on the prospects, especially.
So, and from there I would like to draw the perspective for the future. So, obviously in our research and technical approach, we should not ignore the different identities that exist, that will exist, and we have to incorporate those things. Identity politics also exists, it will exist, but whether in the future prospect, from the perspective of future things, do we need to give space to the identity politics. As Ricado rightly pointed out, there are some limitations for that. And here I would like to conclude, especially in case of India, my view is that identity politics has its limitations, and there can be only two groups. And if we want to see some society based on equality, then there has to be some unity on the basis of oppressed and oppressed.
I totally agree. What I mean is that for that to take place, to avoid identity politics taking over the political battle, we need to understand them and to avoid the conflicts they arise from. Not that they have any future role in an egalitarian society.
And just to, if I look at the South African case in terms of labor and land, the World Economic Forum, besides being the most unequal, they've also categorized as the South African working class as the most militant, right?
The most?
Militant.
Okay.
So we have different categories of struggles. We have every day thousands and thousands of protests, which is called service delivery protests. And so we have struggles at the point of production, but outside of the point of production, even more important struggles are emerging for housing, services, and land. However, the big challenge that we are faced with is there is no institutional vehicle that can coordinate these struggles so that we can move beyond the current impasse to a more equitable society. I think, and one has to name the problem by its name. And I don't like the name neoliberalism because the problem is capitalism, right? As if we going to change some, distribute some welfare gain and things, it will not change society. And so the key prospects in South Africa, I think, is ripe for anti-capitalist struggle. But there is the twin threat of a right-wing turn by the working class and the prospect for nationalism. And how do we combat that? We need independent organization of peasants and workers. So if structurally it creates land and labor, one also have to think politically how these two forces, the landless and the workers, create a united type of institutional vehicle, because the struggles are much interrelated. So I am very in the one hand optimistic about anti-capitalist struggles, but there are also threats like being channeled into an identity type of politics.
I think that is a
Stella? So I think we are going to end this interview here. Thanks to everyone who agreed to take part. It was great to further the conversation outside of the room, and the formality of maybe the seniority. But thank you so much. It was great meeting you all, and it was great having this conversation with you.
Thank you.
The different identities that exist, that will exist, and we have to incorporate those things. Identity politics also exists, it will exist, but whether in the future prospect, from the perspective of future things, do we need to give space to the identity politics? As Ricado rightly pointed out, there are some limitations for that. And here I would like to conclude, especially in case of India, my view is that identity politics has its limitations, and there can be only two groups. And if we want to see some society based on equality, then there has to be some unity on the basis of oppressed and oppressed.
I totally agree. What I mean is that for that to take place, to avoid identity politics taking over the political battle, we need to understand them and to avoid the conflicts they arise from. Not that they have any future role in an egalitarian society.
And just to, if I look at the South African case in terms of labor and land, the World Economic Forum, besides being the most unequal, they've also categorized us as the South African working class as the most militant, right?
The most?
Militant.
Okay.
So we have different categories of struggles. We have every day thousands and thousands of protests, which is called service delivery protests. And so we have struggles at the point of production, but outside of the point of production, even more important struggles are emerging for housing, services, and land. However, the big challenge that we are faced with is there is no institutional vehicle that can coordinate these struggles so that we can move beyond the current impasse to a more equitable society. I think, and one has to name the problem by its name. And I don't like the name neoliberalism because the problem is capitalism, right? As if we going to change some, distribute some welfare gains and things, it will not change society. And so the key prospects in South Africa, I think, is ripe for anti-capitalist struggle. But there is the twin threat of a right-wing turn by the working class and the prospect for nationalism. And how do we combat that? We need independent organization of peasants and workers. So if structurally it creates land and labor, one also have to think politically how these two forces, the landless and the workers, create a united type of institutional vehicle, because the struggles are much interrelated. So I am very in the one hand optimistic about anti-capitalist struggles, but there are also threats like being channeled into an identity type of politics.
I think that is
So I think we are going to end this interview here. Thanks to everyone who agreed to take part. It was great to further the conversation outside of the room, and the formality of maybe the seniority. But thank you so much. It was great meeting you all, and it was great having this conversation with you.
Thank you.